If your team's trying to move faster with AI or scale more efficiently without reinventing the wheel, InfoQ Dev Summit Munich 2025, this October 15 to 16, might help. It's a practical event. Talks from people in the trenches, sharing what they've actually shipped, fixed, or learned. No big launches or buzzwords, just useful ideas you can take back to your team the next day. Learn more at devsummit.infoq.com. Good day, folks. This is Shane Hastie for the InfoQ Engineering Culture Podcast. Today, I'm sitting down at opposite sides of the world with Natan Žabkar Nordberg. Natan, welcome. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us.
Welcome to you too. Thank you, Shane. It's great to be here.
I'm outside Wellington in New Zealand, and you're in Edinburgh, Scotland. So we are as far apart as it's possible to be, but joined by the miracles of technology. My normal starting point in these conversations is, who's Natan?
Well, that's a question that cuts a little bit deeper than the usual, what do you do, right? I'll cheekily answer that part first, actually. So I'm an engineering manager, which doesn't really tell you much since it can mean very different things for different companies. But the important part for me is that I absolutely love all the main parts of my job. And the way I see them, there's three of them. There's the technical part, which can either be, low-level technical work, writing code, things like that, or more high-level, which is, architectural discussions, talking about technical problems in a general sense, things like that. Then there's the organizational side of things, which is, kind of leading teams, organizing people, kind of turning a little bit of that chaos into order. And then there's the people side of things, with which I mean both the kind of your usual line management, but also the more personal management. So for instance, I don't believe that when I'm a manager, I'm just a manager for the company. My job is not to just get the most out of a person for the company or anything like that. My job is also to help support the person themselves. And perhaps the best way to support them is to tell them that they should be looking for something else, not my company specifically. And I feel that that last part is definitely, to me, the most important part of my job, the people part. Everything else I can kind of do at home or in some kind of other way, but the people part is very different. It's never the same. It is very different with every single person. It is super interesting, and it is not something you can do at home. But the fact that I like all those parts of my job means that over the years I shifted to startups because there I get to wear multiple hats. But your question was, who am I? Well, I have a bit of a non-traditional background. As you can probably hear, I'm not originally from Scotland. I was actually born and raised on a farm in Slovenia, which is a small country in between Italy, Austria, Hungary, and Croatia, about 2 million people. And even though I've always loved tech, I also always knew I wanted to do something related to people. So even though I was kind of, in the evenings playing around with some code and learning how to code a little bit at home, I actually studied theoretical mathematics. And then I've been a tutor, I've been a teacher, I worked on the stage and off the stage in theater, and I've done a bunch of other things. But in the end, kind of as expected, the tech part prevailed and I started properly getting into that. And when I had a chance, I then moved to management to kind of get me back into that people aspect of things. So I guess my life went through a couple of twists and turns, especially when I also met my wife here, who is Swedish, and we started a family. And I definitely don't think my 20-year-old self could have predicted where I'll end up. But at the end of the day, not that much has changed. I feel I see myself as a person who hopes to make life a little bit better for the people around him in whatever small way I can. And I think that part has actually stayed the same since I was a lot younger than I am now.
This is the Engineering Culture Podcast, where we go deep into the people stuff. Let's start with culture. What is good culture in an engineering context?
I think that's a very interesting question because I don't believe it has a singular answer. I think good culture is the culture that works for you specifically. And I think that what works for you might be very, very different than what works for me. I think what works for you might also be different than what works for you in 3 months' time because we change. So I think the right question to answer is maybe not even good, but what is the right culture for you at this point in time? And what might be the right culture for you in the future? I became a dad about a year ago, almost exactly a year ago now. And obviously, what was best for me changed at that time. I started prioritizing more personal life. I started prioritizing more security, things like that, right? But I think there are probably a couple of core questions you always need to ask yourself, which is, questions like, do you want an environment where, you're pushed and everybody tries really hard? Do you want an environment where people go to work and work is just work? Do you want an environment where people socialize and they become friends? Do you want an environment where people leave you alone? These are the kind of questions you should ask yourself to identify what's good for you. So I can talk a bit about what's good for me if you want to, but I don't think there's an answer to what is just good in general.
Cool. So what's good for you?
So I think there's a couple of things that are really important to me culture-wise. I think in no particular order, I want to be at a place, where I can feel like people are people. And I don't limit that just to the employees of the company. I want a place that treats, be it the employer, be it the employee, be it, so your coworkers or yourself, be it people who are your clients or users or whatever, or be it just, the random person that comes in to deliver mail. I want to have a company that treats them as people. Now, that could mean just being nice to them, because we're all humans and it's nice to be nice to each other, right? But it also means understanding that they come with their own, let's call them needs and wants. The example I tend to use, so I tend to work remotely for the past couple of years. I've been working fully remote for the past 3 years or so. And one of the common questions I get from my direct reports is questions like, can I go to the gym or can I go to the store in the middle of the workday? And I used to answer that by saying, you do what you want to do. You're an adult. I don't really care. And then I realized that's actually a really bad answer because it's not true. I do care. I care that they get to do what makes their lives better if it doesn't, hurt me or the company especially, right? And I care about them doing what makes them more effective. I always feel like you kind of see things both as a person and as an employee of the company that tries to make people effective when you're a manager. And this helps both cases, which is great. And I always tell people, as long as it works for the people you work with, please organize your day the way you see fit because it's better for you. So that's kind of what I mean with seeing people as people, right? Then there are a couple of other things, again, in no particular order. I spend a lot of time at work. It's important to me that I can be myself. For me, that means that I can be a little bit silly. I don't need to make great friends, but I want to be at least friendly with the people I work with. And that I don't have to, play, well, we all play a role sometimes, but that I don't have to constantly play a role, that I can have an honest conversation with somebody, that I can be who I am, that I can talk about my hobbies. Those things are important to me. There's a couple of other parts, I guess, when it comes to work. I do not want to do things that actively make the world a worse place. I'll let you all decide what that means. But, I would not want to work for a company that I believe is actively making the world a worse place. I will admit I'll not go as far anymore to say I really want to make the world a better place. It's a little bit naive. And I think that usually we are making the world a better place in some small way, be it by helping somebody get a better device, you are booking, or booking a hotel better or traveling easier or whatever. Those are all making the world a better place in a small way. But I think the slightly childish idea of we're all saving the world has sadly been hit with a dose of realism through the years. So these are the kind of things I care about.
In your role as a manager, as a leader of teams, how do you help your folks take that ownership for themselves?
Again, a very good question. I think that there are a couple of different things you need for people to be able to take kind of clear ownership of things. It's not a super simple answer. I would say it probably starts with trust. I'm going to have a slightly controversial statement coming here, which is that I don't believe that trust can be earned unless it's given first. It is very difficult for somebody to prove that you can trust them unless you give them an opportunity to prove that you can trust them. And I think especially in remote environments, again, that becomes even more difficult because you lack some of these day-to-day interactions. So what I think is a very effective way of doing this, and this is also something I experienced myself from my own manager, is that you kind of actively give your trust to people. You say, I will trust you with this. You discuss what does that actually mean? And then you actually trust that person, as easy as it sounds to say that. But what I mean by that is like, you don't then, micromanage. You don't look over their shoulder the whole time. You don't step in and say, oh, I can help you. We're going to do this better together. No, you actually let them do their own thing. You support them, obviously. But, you have maybe like a weekly session where you say, what can I help you with and stuff like that? Or maybe you kind of agree on limitations, on discuss things like, are you responsible? Are you accountable for it? Am I going to have your back, or am I going to completely remove myself from the conversation to ensure that, I can really confidently say, if somebody comes in and says, Did they do a good job? I can be like, well, you've seen the job that was done, and I was not there even once. I was in 0 meetings. And I can really, it's both helpful for them because I can really prove that they have done the work. And it's also a little bit scary for them because it means if something goes wrong, I'm not there to support them. So this trust is kind of like a bit of a two-way street. It's an agreement between people, but I think it is an agreement. You tell them, I'm going to trust you. And I think that with trust, people suddenly become a lot more autonomous. And if they are autonomous, there's still an interesting problem you might hit, which is that we often think about autonomy as kind of, we will give you nothing, just go and solve a problem, right? But I don't think that's the best way of doing it because, so I believe that we as humans don't tend to work well with no limitations. Telling somebody completely greenfield, you can do whatever you want. It's never really true, right? Because we all have our own limitations on our product, on our expectations. If I tell somebody something like this and they say, oh, I'm going to take me 27 years to build this, of course I'm going to say no. So what I try and do instead is guided autonomy, which is, not a term that I have coined or whatever. It's, it's quite a common term. And it really just means putting some limitations and putting some boundaries around that person. I am a mathematician by trade. So I almost see this as vectors. And, as long as the vector is pointing in the right general direction, they get to guide it exactly how it goes and where it goes. But I need to point in the general direction. So I think with those two things, with a combination of trust and autonomy, people will feel empowered to take the initiative they need, and they will be able to actually take proper ownership. Because to me, delegating something with a bunch of strings attached and treating somebody like a second pair of hands doing exactly what you do, that's not somebody owning it, right? That's just somebody executing on the task you could have executed on. That's not where we get the value.
What if the person doesn't have the fundamental skill to do the role? How do you help them build the competency, build the skill?
I guess the assumption here is that they want to actually build that skill and that role. Another thing about me is that I believe that while certain progressions are quite natural, let's say, a junior developer to a mid-level developer, that's a very natural progression. You're just going to do the same thing, but do it better, right? There's definitely a part you reach in your career where progression becomes a very conscious choice. I will change what I'm doing. I'll do it in a different way. I will do something like that, right? So assuming we're talking about a situation where a person wants to change or wants to do this role instead of feeling like they have to for whatever reason, then I think you just kind of work with them. You talk to them, you say, let's talk a little bit about, what you're doing right now and where you need to be able to achieve what this role requires. And this role could either be a big role like a senior engineer or principal engineer, or it could be a smaller role like leading this project. I think that depending on the person, it can be quite useful to do a bit of a gap analysis if they're more of a rational approach person, and then, analyze all the gaps and kind of say, hey, here are the things that you're doing, because gaps go both ways, right? Here's the things you're actually doing better than expected, and here's the things where you might need to improve a little bit, right? And then with that, hopefully you have enough guidance to talk about how do we improve things. And I think that's where it goes back to a similar thing I talked about in trust, right? It's a two-way conversation. Some people work best by just being, thrust into it, and they have to deal with it, and they're stressed and they feel, in quotes, terrible, but actually enjoy it. That's how they grow, right? Some people really want a massive safety net, and they kind of say, I feel safest and best if I grow really slowly with a lot of support. I wanted to be here. So it really depends on each specific person how you want to deal with it. But I think that assuming they are not completely new to the business or to their career, they will have a decent understanding of how they work best. And I think your job as a manager is to support them in what they do best, not force your way of working and thinking upon them.
The primary unit of value delivery today in most organizations now is the team. What makes a good team?
What kind of business are you? So what I mean is, are you the kind of business that cares primarily about your product and deliver that product? Or your business cares about the long-term, let's call it team health and team quality? As in, I feel like I've talked to especially startups where they're kind of like, it's all about the product. And then talk to startups who are like, it's all about the team. If this team pivots to something else, we'll still be happy, we'll still be effective. And some people are like, no, it's the product. The team can change 5 times. The product matters. Do you want to guide that question more, or?
Well, I have a bias towards the long-lived stable team. I did write the book, No Projects.
Yep. I assumed you would say that. Yeah. I would say that if your focus is on the team, then it is really important to build, let's call it a culture, and I mean like a team culture, not just company culture, where people can bring their best selves. That means anything from, just encouraging people. Like on the positive sides, it means things like, encouraging people. It means things like helps, working towards their strengths, helping shore up their weaknesses, stuff like this. On the negative side, it also means managing any conflicts that appear very thoroughly. I think in a team that wants to be long-lived and wants to work together closely, there is no option to say, oh, these two people don't work together well. We'll just kind of put them on side projects. They'll just not interact with each other, right? While in a bigger team that cares more about the product delivery, you could do something like that. So I think you have to be very conscious of ensuring people go through enough shared experiences that they become a cohesive unit. They understand each other's communication patterns, they understand what drives each other, and they are willing to put other people first before themselves. Because turns out if everybody does that, everybody benefits. But if you then have one person who says, no, I'm going to put myself first while everybody else is putting each other first, right? That can cause a massive conflict in the team. So I think you have to be a lot more careful about managing, let's call them the outliers in this team when it comes to the cultural side. And then what I would say is, you have an effective team, they can work on anything really, right? If you get people to work together well, then any problem you throw at them, I think nowadays there are exceptions. There are certain companies that work on, the deep, detailed, really kind of hardcore tech. That's different. But most of us work on products that we're not inventing completely new things, right? We just need people who are decent engineers, who are good at working together, who are good at the product side of things. But the tech is comparatively easy in nature, right? Does that answer your question?
It starts to. What about the diversity in that team? I know that you've got some particular perspectives on what is diversity. So let's dig into that.
Yeah, so I would say I care a lot about, well, this mark as diversity and inclusion. But when we talk about diversity, I want to go a little bit beyond what is often marked as diversity in the media or in the reports you see, right? So what I mean by that is not that I do not care about the fact that people are from different countries or different genders or different skin colors and things like that. I do care about it because it affects your lived experiences. But what I really care about is those lived experiences. Two people could look almost exactly the same, but they grew up in a completely different environment. They'll have a very different way of thinking. They'll have a very different way of learning. They'll have a very different way of communicating. And two people could look massively different just when you just look at them, but it could have grown in such a similar environment that maybe they're actually closer than two people who look very similar, right? And I think that you get a lot of power and a lot of strength from this diversity. Very silly example. I mentioned before in Slovenian, one of the things when I started coding, I used to work on like CMS systems. And I used to use some very basic options for doing translations. And a lot of those options only supported singular and dual, right? So you could choose, whatever. Bob has one apple, Bob has two apples. But turns out that certain languages have more than that. Slovenian has singular, has dual, has plural, and then has kind of a second kind of plural in a way. So instead of just having let's call it an if statement for singular and for plural, I needed multiple if statements for singular, for dual, for plural, and for a second kind of plural. And that's something you wouldn't really know unless somebody tells you about it. And somebody probably wouldn't know about it unless they lived it, right? So I've worked in teams that had people from various backgrounds, coming from, a classical kind of software engineer training to having a master's in Greek mythology and then switching to software engineering. And everybody brought a very different way of thinking about things, how they would solve problems, how to approach problems, and how we think about our product. So I guess that's the other part of the question. What makes a team effective is I think that the team has to be built in a way that it can actually handle the problems. And part of that is also diversity, be diversity of, your lived experiences, diversity of thinking, but also diversity of skill sets, right? You might want a designer, you might want a product person, you might want an engineer, front-end engineer, back-end engineer, right?
Those very different perspectives come often with very different assumptions. How do we get the best and avoid the conflict? Or do we actually want some conflict?
Yeah, so I think what you're getting at is the fact that, I talked earlier about needing the team to work well together. And turns out people that are similar find it easier to work together well because they just naturally do similar things. And on the flip side, people who are diverse tend to naturally have a few more conflicts. Be it good conflicts, as in there's the conflicts we want, right? The conflicts that we kind of say, hey, I disagree with you because my experience tells me this is better. and we can work together. It's not a personal conflict. It's a product conflict, let's call it, where we all know we're on the same side, but we are kind of disagreeing on how to get there, right? But it also does lead to personal conflicts. Communication patterns are a big one, right? Somebody might not appreciate somebody being very direct, while somebody else might not appreciate that other person being very non-direct. And they get frustrated because they're like, just tell me what you want directly, right? That's a very common pattern I see as somebody who moved to the UK, where people tend to be less direct, and then also worked with a lot of people more from like the eastern side of the world, which tend to be on average more direct. And seeing the difference between people and the frustrations that build sometimes when people thought they were saying the same thing. Well, actually, they were saying the same thing, but they were saying it in such a different way, they did not realize they were saying the same thing. So your question was, right, how do we handle some of those conflicts? I think the main thing is needing to understand each other. And there's a funny thing about people, right? When if you ask them things, they usually answer. So if you just ask them, what did you mean by that? They tend to be able to answer. Say, hey, now there's just the two of us instead of 10 other people listening in. Can you just tell me directly what you meant? Like, because I'm afraid I misunderstood it. There's actually a concept that I quite like, which is, well, at least I came across in it in Dungeons and Dragons, which I don't know if you've played it or not.
Personally, I haven't, but I've been around many D&D players.
Okay. For any listeners who have not played it, it's called a role-playing tabletop game, where it's very different in other games in the sense that there is no real board or like world or things you do, right? It's not like playing, I don't know, Settlers of Catan, where you just kind of do this thing, The whole world is created by one of the players called the DM, the Dungeon Master, and they create everything. And then the other players get to kind of play in it like a sandbox. And the really nice thing about it is that you can create everything. That's awesome. And the really bad thing about it is that you can create everything, and that's terrible unless you know what your players want. So in D&D, what people started doing is what they call a session zero. So instead of the first session, you have a session zero where you talk about what do we want to get out of this game? Do we want to like be really strictly following the rules because we really care about the rules? Or do we just want to say, the rule of cool? If it's cool, we get to do it. Hey, we're just going to go around and fight everybody. Or actually, you want to say, I'm really interested in political intrigue. So let's create a world that talks about that, because it's your world. You do whatever you want, right? I think a similar concept, not that it's your world, you do what you want, but the idea of let's talk about how we do things can be applied to work. So I just called it a session zero myself. And it's a session that I tend to have with my direct reports or also with my coworkers, where we talk about how do we work together. And there's lots of things you can discuss there, right? There's communication patterns. I can say things like, hey, I tend to be quite direct, especially in one-on-one settings. So if you prefer me not to be, let me know and I'll try and be less direct. But please keep in mind that if I am direct, I will never ever try and be rude. It's just my natural inclination, right? I can ask people like, do you prefer to be praised publicly or privately? Because I think some people really appreciate that kind of public praise and some people really shy away from it. I can also tell people, again, my own limitations and say, look, I am trying to be better at this, but my natural inclination is that if things are going well, I don't say anything. I don't know why, just how I am, right? And I'm trying to be better at that. But that means that if they know that, they can assume that if I'm not saying anything, they're doing a good job. And I can tell them, I promise you, if I see something that makes me think you might not be meeting expectations, I will talk to you immediately. Like I will not wait for next week or next month. I will talk to you now. And I think setting this kind of set of patterns, rules, whatever you want to say, you can follow in your conversations means that you get to understand each other a lot better. So going back to the team, right? You might not want to do it to the same level of detail, but there are, team norms we can usually discuss, right? There are team communication patterns we can discuss, figure out what people care about. Oftentimes, those are ways that are not part of work. I feel you learn more about people in these ways by going out and grabbing lunch together or talking about, I don't know, the shows they enjoy and stuff like this, because people will learn about thinking patterns and communication patterns that way. They'll learn about how people joke. They'll learn about, their humor. And that will make them realize, when they said that thing, they were actually just kind of joking around. They didn't mean it seriously, right? Or actually, when they said that thing, they were definitely serious. I should take it seriously too. I shouldn't now joke back, So to try and bring it together, if you figure out a way to get people to understand each other, I think you can work around a lot of these conflicts that you don't want, while at the same time encouraging the, in quotes, conflicts you do want. These different ideas, because they're not supposed to be conflicts. They're different ideas on how to solve the problem we have. And if everybody knows we're on the same side, we're trying to solve the same problem, we're working together, and we appreciate each other's different opinions, then I think you have a very strong team coming together instead of a team that, hates each other.
I know that you have a background in improv, and you mentioned that earlier as well. What have you brought from the world of improv into leading and working in teams?
Probably two things, maybe three things. One is, as sad as it sounds, fake it till you make it is a thing. And turns out that sometimes people need the illusion of confidence more than actual confidence. So that's something that I definitely learned in improv. You go on stage, you don't know what you're doing, but you need to start doing something and need to be committed to that. But what you also learn there is that you have a team of people who support you. They're on your side. If they see you go on stage and start fixing a car, they will make a whole scene around you about how fixing a car is really important right now. And I think the same thing can happen at work. A team of people you trust, you kind of say, hey, I'm not quite sure what we need to do, but let's commit to this specific part. Let's try our best to do this. Let's not let people question everything 10 times, but let's commit to this thing. And then let's pivot if we need to, right? So fake it till you make it a little bit in leadership positions can be important because people look up to you to understand what you're doing. Or to put it a little bit more nicely, one of the things I enjoy trying to do is turning chaos into order. So what you usually get is the chaos of the outside world coming in saying, there's all the things we could do. And then you try and create here are the 3 things we're doing. Here's the 100 things we're not doing. So team, let's focus on these 3 things. Even if you're not actually confident those 3 are the best choice, they don't have to be the best choice. They just have to be a good choice. Because doing 3 good things is better than not doing any perfect things. So I think that's one thing. The other part is going back to what I mentioned about guided autonomy before. There's this very interesting thing that happens when you put a person on stage. If you tell them you can do anything you want, I would say like 90% of people freeze and they do nothing. But then when you add a lot of really silly limitations, you tell them, you can only speak in rhyme, or you have to say exactly 7 words per sentence, or you have to hop on 1 leg while you talk, or whatever. You put like the silliest limitations on them. And suddenly people are so preoccupied thinking about how they can solve the problem within these limitations, they actually start doing something. And suddenly this whole scene starts about people hopping on 1 leg and talking in rhyme and about, I don't know, they drank a weird potion that made that happen. Now they need to find a wizard to help them out or whatever, because they have these things added to them. So again, on work, that is hopefully slightly less silly limitations, but the limitations can help us, right? I think those will be kind of the main things. There's definitely a bit of a benefit in being comfortable, let's call it on stage, with people's focus on you. I used to be extremely uncomfortable on stage. I would not go up there. Never, ever, ever. And through kind of learning that, yeah, a lot of people are uncomfortable with it, but they still do it. You kind of learn that, let's just go with it. And then it's not that bad in the end, And as any skill, you kind of just learn to deal with it.
Natan, we've covered a lot of ground. Really interesting stuff. If somebody wants to continue the conversation, where would they find you?
I am actually not very good at being on any social media. I don't know if I would say I'm a private person or I never put any time and effort into it. So I guess I could say you can find me on LinkedIn. I think my name is unique enough that you will not find anybody else with that name.
Well, again, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thank you very much, Shane. It was a pleasure.